Well, hello all, and thank you all very much for coming along. I might say this is my first webinar. I'm quite excited to see all these kind of faces popping up. It's a new experience so far. It's good, and so I'm delighted you've all come. I'm just going to start by saying a few words about me, partly because it's always a pleasure. And partly because I want to give you a sense of the kind of background, the perspective I'm bringing to this. So I first got involved in community heritage way back in the year 2000. So that's coming of age now. I'm 21 years in it. And at that time, I lived in what's now the city of Brighton and Hove. And I set up something called the My Brighton and Hove Community Heritage website. It was originally a Millennium project. I expected it to kind of run for about 6 months, but it's still going 21 years later. I ran it as a volunteer for the first 6 years, and what was sort of new about it and different then was it was one of the very first sites that was a contributory heritage website. In other words, we were encouraging people to upload their photos and memories long before that was commonplace. This was kind of 2 years after Google was founded and long before Facebook was conceived. So at that time, it was quite a pioneering thing to do. And as a result, we got interest from lots of other groups who wanted to do a similar thing. And another volunteer from the project and I set up a website company called Community Sites back in 2006. And what we do is we specialize in community heritage. We set up websites and online catalogs for community heritage projects. And I guess it's in the UK and Ireland mainly. And we've set up about over 150 websites and catalogs and maintained them since we started. And alongside doing that, when I first started kind of, like looking above the parapet and moving on from the kind of local Brighton view to the national view, I became, along with Andrew, one of the very early committee members of the Community Archives and Heritage Group. And that was set up in order to support and promote community archives around the country as a kind of not-for-profit organization. And I should say that when I kind of use the word community heritage, particularly in the context of my work with community sites, what I tend to mean is that the websites are community heritage in 3 senses. One is they tend to revolve around a community, and that could be typically a place, so often it's a village or a town, but it could be a community such as a sports club, it could be a place of work, it could be a performance venue. They tend to be community sites in the sense that there tend to be volunteers involved in running them, sometimes as a kind of paid member of staff, either permanently or temporarily, but the core of it is volunteer run. And they tend to be community projects in the sense that they tend to invite the public to contribute by uploading photos or memories subject to moderation. So that's my background. And I suppose the point about that is I'm not a professional museums person. I'm not a professional archivist. The perspective I bring is very much from that kind of, community heritage, running volunteer groups background. I suppose before that, I did kind of work in multimedia. So I've got slightly kind of, I'm comfortable with technology, so to speak. But I basically, my interest is in trying to keep things as kind of straightforward and practical as possible. So that's what I'll try and do in this presentation. But there is also a declaration of interest because I'm going to be talking to you about kind of getting catalogues online and cataloguing software. And it's a Community Archives and Heritage Group presentation. But of course, I do also run this company that creates catalogues. So there's a declaration of interest there. I've done my very best to be kind of, scrupulously fair, and I'll be kind of mentioning lots of options for you to choose from, including some of our competitors, so to speak. But you can take what I say with a pinch of salt, or indeed ignore it altogether. So that's the introduction. What I'm going to do today is talk to you about four things. The first is we're just going to set the scene, and we're going to talk about an online collection in the context of your website. The second thing is we're going to talk about how you might create your catalogue, and that involves talking on the formidable subject of cataloguing standards. And I'm going to introduce something called the Community Archives Cataloguing Guidelines, which I hope makes them less formidable. Then we're going to look at cataloguing software. We're going to look at the range of things that are available from free to low cost to mid cost. We're not going near the higher cost end that the professionals use, because that's, can be hundreds of thousands of pounds, certainly tens of thousands. And finally, very briefly, I'm just going to kind of share some lessons and experiences and processes from experienced projects, some of whom I've spoken to over the last weeks preparing for this webinar, some of whom I knew already. So that's the plan. Those are the kind of four sections. I think I'll do the first two sections kind of straight through. We'll see how it goes. But then stop for questions. We'll stop again for questions after the cataloguing software, and we'll hope to stop at the end for a more kind of free-flowing set of questions. So that's the plan. So let's begin by setting the scene and talking about your online collection and your website. So over the years, when I've been talking to community heritage groups at the end of the phone for community sites, by and large, when community heritage groups or projects are wanting to go online, there's two things that they want to do. Sometimes they want to do both, sometimes they just want to do one. The first thing is that they want to share the history of the community in some way. In other words, they want to put out a website with articles and memories and photo galleries. It might have some material of their own on it. It might also have material contributed by, a local museum might be willing to share some material, or some other historical society. And they might often have contributions from the public. But basically what they're trying to do is, if you like, kind of create a fairly kind of free form display. I think you'll start using the word exhibition as we carry on, of the heritage of their particular community. The second thing that groups want to do is slightly more formal, that they have a collection of primary source material. Usually it's uniquely theirs. So maybe it's a kind of collection of old photos, maybe it's a set of oral history interviews, maybe it's a set of old documents. And what they want to do is to catalogue that collection and possibly get it online. And going alongside that, quite often they want to digitize the collection. And just to see some examples of those, I mean, if you look at the, sorry about this, I'm going to turn this off.
You should have done that before you started.
To see some examples of this, if we went across to the My Brighton and Hove website, now that's been running a long time. I'm just going to mute that. That's been running a long time. And when you look at it, it's sort of quite carefully indexed. And it's organized into various groupings. But it all consists of these kind of free-form articles or memories or photo galleries. The reason I kind of mention that is because some people, when they're talking about getting their collections online, mean no more than this. They simply mean, well, actually, what we want to do is to get our material up there in a way that's fairly organized, fairly searchable, and archivable. And indeed, My Brighton and Hove has 10,000 pages, and it's archived by the British Library, but it's not a catalogue. If we compare that with this, which is a kind of recently launched website by about Newport-on-Tay, they have sections of the site that are exactly like My Brighton and Hove, in the sense that they have sections of kind of free-form pages and articles and photo galleries on various topics, but they also have a formal archive. And at first sight, the formal archive kind of looks fairly similar, because they've kind of grouped their archive material into subjects, and they've attractively presented it with little thumbnails. But if you go in and explore the archive and drill down to an actual archive item, here we go. You can immediately see all the hallmarks of a catalogue collection. In other words, there's a tightly defined set of fields, standardized fields. You can see that there's a reference number there. You can see it's quite carefully indexed and cross-indexed. And also, by and large, it's got one digital file, one image per catalogue record, because only that single image matches the particular distinctive description down there. Sometimes there are exceptions. Obviously, you might have the back and front of a postcard or whatever, but by and large, the discipline of a catalogue is one digital file per record, standardized fields, and a reference number. And if you compare that with the kind of the freeform sections of the sites, supposing we go across to the kind of My Brighton and Hove style exhibition area, and you look at a section on the ferries there, then immediately you can see the difference, because you've basically got a kind of article. It's not primary source material, it's a kind of interpretive article, which consists of a number of different photos that have been cherry-picked out of the catalogue. So there's two kind of things that are going on there. One is, if you like, the exhibition area, and the other is the catalogue. And so switching back, those are the two things that you might want to have up on your website. Obviously, there is potentially a third, which is that you might want to promote your activities as an organization. So you're going to have things like news and events, and a contact us link, and donations, etc. And in a sense, you could therefore think of your overall online presence as being a combination, you know, in kind of, if you think of a physical museum as that exhibition area where you're sharing the history of your community, is like the kind of, you know, the front room of a museum where you have the exhibition area that's for the general public. Then you have the back room of the museum where you've got your catalogue, and the museum curators cherry pick stuff out of their catalogue to put on display in the website. And finally, you've got the visitor's desk where you're promoting what you do. And the kind of practical point of all this is that if you're thinking of getting your catalogue online, and you're content to do all these three things not under the same website, not under the same login, that's relatively cheap and low cost, or possibly even free. Particularly, you know, as we'll see with kind of cataloging, you can have a separate catalog website, which of course you can link to your own. If you're trying to integrate them all, so you have if you like a single media library, and everything is under one roof, one login, one kind of back-end interface, then that's where things start costing some money. So that's the overview of the context of the website and the catalogue. If we now kind of look at how you actually kind of create your catalogue, I'm going to talk a little bit about that and cataloging standards, because they actually also influence, you know, the choice of software and how you get things online. So first thing to say is that up and down the country, and this is true kind of internationally as well, I think, all the museums follow one particular set of cataloging standards. And Slightly unhelpfully, perhaps, all the record offices follow a slightly different set of cataloguing standards. But they do have an awful lot in common, as you would expect. So there's always a title field, there's always a reference number, there's always a creator field, there'll be always a date field. But there is a difference. And so what the Community Archives and Heritage Group did is we created something called the Community Archive Cataloguing Guidelines. And we basically sat down, we talked to somebody from the British Library about the museum standard, somebody about the National Archives, about the archival standard, and we drew out a set of core fields which would help community archive projects record their collections in ways that are consistent with either way of doing things. So there's a limited set of core fields which are attempted to be presented in a fairly user-friendly way. And you can download those guidelines at communityarchives.org.uk. But the difference between the two ways of doing things, the kind of museum versus the archival way, still persists, and the guidelines describe both, and they do matter because you might be doing either one or the other. You can't really do both. And so let's quickly talk these through and see some kind of examples on catalogue sites. So the first is the kind of archival top-down approach, I tend to call it. And this is what the kind of big archives, the big record offices do. And I guess they're doing it because if you imagine they're kind of receiving thousands of different kind of records from different organizations every year. And so imagine they kind of receive the records of Horton Sports Club, for example. And that consists of kind of 3 packing cases of stuff. They may never get time to go down and kind of catalogue the individual items, or it may take an awful long time. So the first thing they do is they start with an overview record of the entire Horton Sports Club collection, and it will have an extent field that says this consists of 3 packing cases, 1 of photos and 1 of minutes and 1 of letters. Then when they get time, they open up the packing case and describe the contents of each one in another set of 3 records. And then if they get time, they go down to the item level, and at that point they kind of describe the individual items. Now I kind of simplify. I mean, in fact, the kind of our professional record offices have about 7 levels, but you get the idea. There's a kind of a series of overview records, and of course those might also be kind of indexed by subject. Now, if you see what that looks like when you go into a website, so this is an example of the Turvey History Group. That's a kind of a village in the UK. And if you look at the archive, what they've done is they've got a hierarchical collection. And when you look down the list of top-level overview records, it's basically describing where different things have come from. And that tends to be what the kind of archivist's first port of call. They tend to say that the way you're going to organize your catalog is by what they call provenance, i.e. you base it on where your groupings, by where things come from in the first instance. And so then if you look down to the Dave Easton collection, so Dave Easton's been collecting postcards of Turvey since 1978. That's the overview record. So the extent field says there are 73 postcards and 4 photographs. And then down below, you have the listing of all the individual records. And when you go down to the individual records, then you can see if you look at the reference number, that's the telltale sign of an archival catalogue, that they have this kind of / to indicate the hierarchy. But of course, they're also indexed by subject and by format, so you can still search them by those topics. But that's the kind of archival approach. You might say, well, what if we've got a big room full of stuff to catalogue and we don't know who it came from, and the archivist would then bring another kind of point of principle to bear, which they would say, well, what you do is you catalog it in the order you found it. So if you find it in various boxes, you don't get out and start resorting it. You catalog it according to how you found it, in case there's a logic that you don't yet understand, perhaps, about how it's been organized. The other way of doing things is by and large more akin to what the museums do, where they have a kind of flat catalogue, i.e. it's kind of object by object by object by object. Each one is an individual item. Each one, therefore, if you were digitizing, would have a file, digital file associated with it. And the numeric sequence just runs from 1 upwards. But again, of course, you'll attach kind of keywords to help you sort it out. And by and large, I mean, again, I oversimplify because museums do group things together. That's by and large the kind of the other kind of way that catalogues tend to be structured. And if we look at an example of that, this is the St Margaret's Village History in Kent. This is their catalogue. Now they've got about 4,000 things in their catalogue. You obviously don't want to kind of immediately see a list of 4,000 items in front of you, because that would be impenetrable. And always when you're presenting your catalogue, you're trying to present it to 2 groups of people, those who know what they're looking for and those who don't. So for the people who know what they're looking for, you have a search screen, which we might be looking at a little bit later. But for those who don't, they've taken their kind of the groupings by subject. And so if you worked your way down through the subject matter hierarchy, you would come to the individual item. In this case, we have got 2 images because it's the front and back of a single document that is described below. And there again, you see the kind of telltale sign of a flat catalogue, which has got a great big long number that is just a sequential number. So those are the 2 ways in which catalogues are typically structured. And if you've already got a catalogue, then the kind of tip, I guess, is to have a look at the reference number, because that will often give you a clue of how it's organized. But the key practical point about this is that your choice of online cataloging software is affected by the structure of your catalog, whether it's hierarchical or flat. Because if you look around the software that's available, it is primarily either designed for archives, for a hierarchical structure, or it's primarily designed for a flat structure. And there can be workarounds, so you can sort of manage to navigate your way around that a bit, but you're sort of slightly going against the grain. Cataloging software tends to be built or configured for either one or the other. And in fairness, I think it's probably true to say that there's far more options available to you if you have a flat catalog than if you have a hierarchical one. But that's not a sufficient reason in itself to go down that route. If you haven't got a catalog at all and you're trying to kind of work out how to begin listing your collection and which way to go, then, well, if you do have any kind of listing at all, even if it's in kind of paper form and not in a spreadsheet, then maybe start with that. Don't throw that away and just work out what its current structure is and compare it with the community archive cataloging guidelines and adapt accordingly. If you are being supported by a museum or archive, then obviously it makes sense to do what they do. You'll find if you look around the kind of toolkits, Norfolk Archives have just produced a great one for the archival approach of doing things, and Sporting Heritage is going to produce one later, a toolkit this year in September, I think, which will be more like the museum approach, as from what I've seen so far. Then I would go with that. So particularly if you're being advised by somebody, go with how they want to do it. And also if you're going to donate your collection or a copy of it to a museum or archive, then again, go with what they do. If that doesn't apply and you've got completely free reign, it's down to kind of practicalities. There are advantages. For example, if you have a room of physical stuff and you're trying to kind of get a handle on it, there's great advantages to the kind of hierarchical overview records approach, because you can begin by describing it all fairly quickly. All you need to do is a series of kind of a dozen kind of overview records perhaps, and you've already managed to get a kind of a structure in place for describing the catalogue. Conversely, which is another very common situation for community heritage projects, if you're just at the beginning and you want to start building up a collection related to your local area, you don't plan to create a physical archive, all you're going to do is to scan stuff and give it back to people, then you're probably going to be scanning everything. You're doing it one by one, and by and large the kind of flat structure is simpler. So that's a bit of a tour through it. It is all kind of talked through in the community archive cataloging guidelines. It's a slightly kind of laboured subject, which I find quite interesting, but I imagine lots of people don't. But it is important because it really does matter when you come to kind of getting your collection online. So at that point, I'm just going to stop and see whether there are any kind of questions.
Hi, Jack. Anna Briggs put a question in the chat, and she asks, do you encourage the people you're advising to use their websites to collect contemporary materials about their communities and then to showcase those contemporary stories online?
Absolutely, yes, I do. I mean, I think the combination of past and present is very seductive. You have to be a little bit more careful simply because of data protection. If somebody is dead, then data protection or defamation doesn't apply. But obviously with living material, you have to be more careful. But I think it brings it to life, absolutely.
And I see that April Woost Ashton has raised her hand. Do you want to ask your question, April?
Yes, thank you. The catalogue software, is it compatible with Macintosh computers?
I'm coming on to that, but by and large, all the cataloging software I'm talking about is stuff that runs online, in which case it makes no difference whether you've got an Apple Macintosh or a PC.
Thank you. The other question that I have is the catalogue listing of all the villages that have contributed over a period of time. Is there a listing somewhere so that you can identify or possibly identify a place that you're looking for data about?
You mean like is there one unified place where everything is brought together?
Yes.
I would say, I mean, not comprehensively. One place you could look at is the Community Archives website, but we've got probably about 750 kind of community archives listed and kind of mapped. So that's one place, but that's by no means all. There's thousands of them. I would say there's not a single place. So somebody might jump in and correct me, but it's quite difficult, I think.
Thank you.
Okay, so I've got a couple more that are in the chat, Jack. So I'll read a couple of these out for you. So do you know how we might create an interactive map plotting location tags for individual text entries, links, and images?
Yes, I do, and I'll show an example of that later.
Excellent. Malcolm Austin asks, does any one system combine both systems of reference by, say, starting with a straight museum numbering and then adding a hierarchical classification?
And I would say no. I mean, I don't think you would do a kind of hybrid kind of between the two. If I talk to you in more detail, we'd probably kind of find a way through what you're trying to do within one or the other. But yeah, I mean, normally when I'm talking to groups, who are using us, I kind of talk them through the options, and we jump one way or the other, but it is one way or the other.
And Jill makes an important point, I think, just to say that even if someone is dead, they may still have living relatives in the community, and it's worth being sensitive to.
Absolutely.
The material is
absolutely right. Yes, irrespective of any legal kind of situations. Absolutely right.
And Iva Harova says it's very important for users to have one place to overview all items. I mean, index categories or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Good point. And also people want to kind of view them in multiple ways. I mean, some people will want to view them geographically on a map. Some people will want to kind of go to a search facility. Some people want to kind of browse by keyword or types of content, such as documents or maps or photos. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's all the comments at the moment. So it's probably a good time to move on.
To crack on. All right, marvelous. All right, so we now come perhaps to the meat of it. So yes, cataloging software. So yes, I mean, you know, kind of picking up on the earlier point, what I'm talking about here is getting your collections online. So there is other cataloging software that is available for you to run locally, you know, that you can download, install on your own computer, and catalog a collection that way. And if you have a local intranet, you could kind of share it by that means. You know, a well-known one for museum software is something called Modes, for example. But what we're talking about now is getting collections online, which means that you're basically hosting the catalog somewhere where it's 24 hours connected to the internet. And that means it's not on your computer, it's on a web hosting company somewhere. And so the options are as follows. And what I'm going to do is kind of talk through a set of options that kind of probably range. We're going to start with the kind of free ones, and then move our way upwards. These are some options. I can't go into everything, and it really is my understanding. So, you know, I'm open to be corrected about all of these things. But let's just first start with one kind of completely free strategy, which is that you could simply, you know, if you carry on kind of cataloging offline, either in a spreadsheet or with some kind of cataloging tool. And incidentally, let me just kind of say, Norfolk Archives have created a little spreadsheet template. I don't think we've got the link for yet, which is going to in their tool, which are going to make available. We can put on the Community Archives website to help you kind of do a hierarchical catalog in a spreadsheet. But if you do your catalog offline as a spreadsheet, or as maybe using a little bit of cataloging software, then one option is to kind of print it out as a PDF, or indeed upload the spreadsheet and make that available as a downloadable document. I mean, it seems obvious, but you could do that. And then alongside that, you could cherry pick particular items, you know, the kind of jewels in the crown to display on the website. And then you just carry on maintaining your catalog offline and upload a new version kind of periodically. So that's obviously a free way of doing it. The second thing you could do, I'm sorry, and other free things you could do if you have kept your catalog online, is you could disseminate it. Oops, let's go across to the National Archives. If this probably does apply if you're in the UK. So the National Archives have on their website a great big search engine that allows people to kind of search the National Archives collection plus other third-party collections. And they're currently encouraging kind of community heritage projects to upload their own spreadsheets into that search engine. And the service is called Manage Your Collections. It's targeted at the archival kind of hierarchical catalog, but they will support you. I think they'll provide a spreadsheet template for you to fill in. And the result of that is that you can get your collection up there on the National Archives site. That's exactly what the Clevedon, Pierre and Heritage Trust did. And so if you look in the relevant section of the National Archives site, you can find a listing of their catalogue and their community archive. It's text only, though I gather that what they're planning to do is to make it possible for you to include a link. So you could host an image elsewhere and link to that image if people wanted to see it. But you know, it's certainly a good offer. What Clevedon decided to do was not upload individual items, but they just uploaded the overview record so people could get a sense of it. And it's also worth saying in passing, in terms of free offerings, that if you are in Wales, there's the People's Collection of Wales. That's more based around the kind of flat approach, and they're encouraging you to upload your photos, your collections related to Wales to their website, and that's also, I think, a good option. The next strategy is to install open source catalog software. So open source means it's basically free. It's been either created by an institution, or it might have been created by the collaborative efforts of volunteer programmers. And what they have done is they've licensed it, so it is in perpetuity free for anybody to download and use. And the result of those things, they often get kind of supported and kind of carried forward and developed. So open source software is free to download. And I'll show you a couple of examples. You do need to install it on a web server. So again, not on your own computer. So that's a trickier business. In the first instance, you need to find a web host who is able to kind of, host that particular bit of cataloging software. But you might get that information from the support forums of the software in question. And you're also going to need a bit of help. You're probably going to find somebody who's technically skilled. You might have a volunteer. Or you could get a freelance. It'd be well within the capacity of any kind of freelance IT developer with a bit of web experience to install a bit of software on a web server and configure it for you. So that's a good option. I think the front runner, for my money, is something called Omaka. Omaka was developed by an American university, and I think it's now possibly run by a trust. It's designed really primarily, again, for flat catalogs, so you could do a kind of workaround. It was designed around to be modeled around kind of WordPress, which, as you might know, is a kind of very often well-used kind of bit of blogging software that's developed to run, most of the websites in the world. And therefore it is quite simple, I would say, for users to use. One organization that's done that is the Tiger Bay Heritage and Cultural Exchange, who are in Wales, in Cardiff. And this is their Omaka site, that one of their sites, who I think is on, I've seen this on the webinar. Trevor Godbold is here. So he created this. He's got some technical experience. He downloaded the software, installed it on a web host. One of the nice things about Omaka is, as well as having the listing of all the individual flat catalog items, there they start, but you can see there's 108 pages of those. Omaka does allow you to kind of group them into particular subject listings. And also it does allow some basic, what I call exhibition pages, freeform exhibition pages. So you can combine some text to interpret the images as well, and group them together. So I think that's a fairly good option. If you're doing hierarchical software, I think you're slightly more of a struggle. There's something called Atom, which has been around a long time. I wonder, because it is kind of geared, it meets the full kind of professional specification, and I suspect you might find it a little bit kind of over complex for your needs, but you can download it, and there is a demo online, so go and have a look. That's that option. The next option is different in the sense, in the way it's kind of simpler, in that you can subscribe to hosted cataloging software. So what that means is that you no longer need to take any software and install it on a server. It's a bit like YouTube. You go to YouTube and you upload your videos and they host them for you. With a hosted service, you go to the hosted service, you upload your catalog records and they host it for you. And you normally will end up paying a monthly or a yearly subscription fee. Your collection might have its own web address, but basically it's going to be published on their site, though they might give you an option to embed it on your own site, though you might need to pay a little bit of money for it. Again, they're primarily for flat museum type catalogs. You need to be a little bit wary, because there are all sorts of ways where you can group things together in these offerings, but it's not quite the same. The hierarchical catalog is one item being the parent or child of another item, which is a slightly different thing from putting multiple items into a group. So maybe be wary of that. Again, I think, but this is big, quite, you know, again, Omaka has a hosted version of it. So if you don't want to download Omaka, which would give you more scope, in fairness, for what you do, but they do have a hosted version where you can go on, and they have a variety of different plans available at different prices, you know, for your subscription per year. And that's a possible option. That's what Kent Sporting Memories did. I think they won a Community Archives Award a few years back. And so that's one of the sites that is hosted on Omaka.net. You can maybe see it up in the address there, sportingmemorieskent.omaka.net. And you know, it's again, you know, they still have the option to kind of have the listing of their items, plus group them in collections, plus have those kind of simple exhibition pages. So I think that's a good option. And another one that's been around a long time, this is proprietary, is eHive, which again, it's kind of primarily for a flat catalogue, but it's a similar model. They'll have different kind of pricing points. They kind of tend to kind of blend everything together. So, you know, in terms of the question about where you can kind of, you know, navigate around multiple items from multiple different kind of collections, that's one approach. Carrying on, your next approach, I would say, is to contract a local website company. If you look around the Community Archives site, I said there were kind of 750 kind of archives listed. Probably the majority are done by some, you know, local company who somebody knows. They might be supportive, local contact, and quite often I suspect they offer quite a good price. So again, I think that's all to be encouraged. The thing you probably need to be aware of for yourself is, you know, they might be reinventing the wheel. You know, there are various kind of, you know, heritage features that they might be reinventing that might be technically difficult, but in terms of, you need to check it's the right wheel. You know, you need to be kind of keeping a bit of an eye on the specification more tightly than you might do if you went to one of the other services. And the final option you have is to go to a specialist heritage website provider. Now, there are lots of companies that do stuff for museums. There are companies that do stuff for professional archives. Companies that specialize in community heritage, very few and far between, probably because there's not actually very much money in the sector. But that's a category that we fit into. You would normally need to do a funding bid. You know, I don't know, the budget's going to be a few thousand either side of, you know, 4,000 basically. So that's well without the range of, you know, what most groups can just lay their hands on without a funding bid, though it's, you know, peanuts for the Heritage Lottery Fund, for example. Though recently, to my surprise, when the Heritage Lottery Fund kind of slightly closed its doors during the pandemic, some groups have succeeded in raising more and more funds through crowdfunding. So that's an avenue that's coming up, I think. You might well want to include advanced years of hosting and maintenance in your funding bid. And the advantage of going with a specialist heritage provider is they should provide some element of hand-holding to kind of guide you through the functionality that you'll need, suggest things that you wouldn't have thought of, and can probably help you with the cataloging process. In terms of options there, I'm just going to give a mention. That was Catalog It, sorry, I've skipped that one. That's another of the hosted offerings. There's something called Past View, which is really, it's from a company called Towns Web Archiving, which I think is primarily a digitization company. But they've started doing Past View is their, if you like, their hosted kind of cataloging offering. But I think they have started doing something called Past View Lite, which is aimed at smaller organizations. And I think they deserve an honorable mention because they're providing a whole year completely free. So they'll set it up for you free, do the training for free. I think it's probably kind of training videos, and the first year of hosting and support is free. And I suspect that's what the LIM Digital Archive have done. They have their own website, I think, for the more kind of complicated visitors desk part of their activities, but that's their digital archive. I think so. Again, it's a flat system rather than hierarchical. Another option is something that, again, it's sort of fairly new. Last few years, there's something called the Museum Platform, which is intended for small museums. It's again done. It's on a kind of a different kind of range of prices. I think they seem very kind of technically accomplished. What they'll do is they basically will give you an integrated WordPress site, but it will incorporate your catalog and your visitors desk and your exhibition area. So it's a kind of one-stop shop. They do operate by importing spreadsheets. So you need to have an existing catalog. They're not providing you with a way of creating a catalog, currently at least. And it tends to be, for the time being, they're dealing with flat catalogs. They can support hierarchical catalogs in the back end, but they need a bit more development to do it in the front end. But I think that's potentially a good option. And finally, of course, there's us. This is community sites, and we have been around, as I say, quite a long time. We will will support either the kind of hierarchical or flat catalog, and will either allow you to kind of catalog online. You can create the catalog from scratch on the website, or you can import a spreadsheet. We slightly prefer you on an ongoing basis to do it online because it's more robust, but you can carry on doing spreadsheet imports. And that's us. Either way, when you're going up to that sort of level and that sort of funding, the kind of facilities that you probably expect to see are, when it comes to the search, I think somebody was asking about search facilities. So this is what's called a faceted search. So that means that you can search under multiple dimensions. So if you see on the left-hand side, you could either start by putting in a keyword, or you could start by putting a subject, choosing a subject, or you could start with a format, or you could start with a particular geographical area, or you could start with a time period. And whichever you choose, it will kind of gradually narrow it down. So you could say, well, I just want to see photos of churches in the 1950s related to this particular geographical area. So that's a very good way of narrowing down a big catalogue. Also, you should get an element of historic mapping that somebody was asking about. Not necessarily, well, historic mapping, I mean, you certainly should get mapping. So this is on the our Warwickshire site. This is a very big site, but one section about it is for Nuneaton. So you should get something like that, which gives a kind of allows you to plot your catalogue records on a map where there is a geographical thing, and then you can link through to each of them. And it is, also possible to kind of overlay historical maps on top of that. That's not too technically difficult. You might need to kind of, pay a rental charge. Most of those maps come from the National Library of Scotland, and they charge a kind of small annual fee for them. But technically, we can add them if you can provide them. And the final thing that you might get is some sort of a date search. So this is on the St Margaret's Village History website, and there you can on the left-hand side, you can narrow down by year or a particular day of the year or a particular time period. So you're getting a kind of a wider choice, I guess, of ways to index the data. And I'm now going to And whichever you do, whichever software you choose, because that's a range I can go through, the golden rule is to check the export facility. So the first thing you should do is go on, do a test run, or kind of, the moment you start, and ask about the export facility and use it, because the worst thing that happens is you put the data in and you can't get it out. You also need to have a decision about where your master catalog is going to be. If you are going to be doing your cataloging online, is that where the final catalog is going to be? And so there's one, and you don't want one master kind of on your spreadsheet in your office and another one up online. One of them has to be the master. So are you going to catalog online and then download copies, or are you going to carry on having the master catalog offline and upload updates to the website periodically? And finally, don't assume that the online catalog is your repository, by which I mean that most online catalogs are not, you're not uploading the original source files. When you kind of scan something, you normally scan it at high resolution to kind of have a high quality copy of it. That's too big a file to upload. So what you tend to do is you tend to keep that offline. You create a smaller kind of version of it that you're going to upload to the website. So normally the catalog is not the same thing as where you actually kind of store your files. And that's the end of that section. The last section, you'll be pleased to say, here is very brief. Any few questions, then let's quickly move on to the last section and close.
So do you want to take a couple of questions now, Jack? Or
Yeah,
do you
just
want
a couple.
to leave them for the end? Okay, so there's
just do a couple, yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple that relate to kind of the hosted sites. So one, what happens to the material if you run out of funding, and a kind of sort of related question, well, to hosted sites is about do any of these sites claim any sort of copyright or ownership over the material you upload to them? Right.
In terms of the first one, that's where the export facility is important. Basically, if that site suddenly went under a bus, make sure you can export it, use the export facility, and get all the content out. Normally, if you've uploaded the digital files in the first place, you've already got a copy of those, so those aren't as crucial. That's often harder to get hold of. But certainly, any data you've put in, you should be able to export. The second question was, remind me.
About whether any of these sites claim any kind of sort of copyright.
I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Not in any significant way.
And there's a number of people who've suggested some other ones, things, but
great.
Come back to it at the end. But Harry asks, can you point him towards any community audio catalogs or collections?
I mean, there's certainly kind of oral history websites that we've done. By and large, and the British Library, of course, there's a National Sound Archive is the biggest one. I can think of some links. Essex Sounds had a nice kind of collection of soundscapes on it, of recordings around Essex, and we've done various oral history websites ourselves, and quite a lot of people have.
Yeah, Omaka. Quite a lot of people use Omaka for oral history sites as well.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Do you want to? I've got a couple more, but do you want to go on and do your last section, and then we'll
okay. Well, very, very briefly then. We're just going to just quickly talk about the cataloging process, and the only thing to really say about that is when I first started actually running a cataloging project, which was creating an online catalog. I was collecting letters and diaries around from Brighton and Hove, and when I had a team of volunteers, and I expected them all to kind of assign each group of letters to a volunteer, and they would do a lot: scan, catalog, maybe even liaise with a contributor, and that wasn't what happened at all. So the model tends to be that your volunteer team take on individual tasks. There's one guy who loved nothing more than scanning, and would take away a huge kind of sports bag full every week. And then some people are meticulous and love to do cataloging, and some people are sociable and like liaising with contributors. And that seems to me to be a kind of fairly common model. There's a project called the Dales Community Archives, who are creating a hierarchical catalogue of archives around the Yorkshire Dales. They, for the people who are not so keen on sort of, computers, the way they do it is they do a handwritten list of the material initially, almost as a social event. It looks a bit spooky in these days of coronavirus, doesn't it, being that close together? And then later they kind of, typed up their list into Word or Excel and gave it a bit of structure. Then they had a separate team who did the scanning. Again, they had one group of people who didn't like the computers, who were carrying the stuff over and kind of packing it away. And one team doing the scanning. They advocated an overhead scanner because it's much, much quicker, a photo scanner, than a flatbed scanner where the scanner head has to move slowly across the document. And then they had a small project team who did the final cataloging. And again, just a similar one. This is the last slide, really. So Margaret's Village history. That's been, they've created a wonderful archive over time, about 4,000 items. But again, what they did is they started by doing everything kind of offline, assigning reference numbers offline, handwritten descriptions offline, then a small team of 3 people to kind of do the scanning and the initial catalog entries. And I think this is a good point. Once the initial catalog entries are created, once you've done the kind of bare bones of the structure, then you can get volunteers to go back in and fill in the descriptions, because they've already got the image in front of them. They've got the title, they've got the reference number. They don't need to bother about the structure. They're just adding the detail. Over to you. And that's the end.
Okay, so we've got just a few minutes without sort of running too far over time. So some of the other I'll come to you, Alan, in a minute. Some of the other packages that have been mentioned, I don't know whether you've got any feelings or knowledge about these. So collective access, collections index, something called Kohar, I think, book list 5, and a question there about, with book list 5, about an ingest system for it. I mean, have you any kind of sort of thoughts on any of those? I mean, obviously you can't list every time.
No, I mean, collective access I've heard of. I do think it maybe kind of does some work as a repository. In fact, again, I think it's quite fully featured and complex. Book list 5 slightly sounds as though it's intended for kind of library purposes, and library cataloging is different again.
Okay, so Alan, do you want to just say your question while I quickly look through all these messages coming up?
Okay, thank you. That's me, is it?
Yep.
Briefly, is it possible just to make a comment? Firstly, we're right at the beginning of this whole process, and this presentation has been very, very helpful.
Hooray!
Can you give a couple of points on what would be the best hardware to take on board? We've got a little bit of funding. And secondly, you haven't mentioned about security, because hackers seem to be the order of the day locally, currently.
Yeah. Well, in terms of equipment, I mean, I can't advise you specifically, simply because what the best buys are changes all the time. The one point I would make about buying a scanner, though, is the key point is speed. Almost all scanners will do a good quality enough image for you nowadays, but it really matters whether it takes 3 seconds or 10 seconds.
Thank you.
In terms of hackers, yes, and indeed, the more popular, widely used open source software is, the more the hackers target it. And that basically means that's why there has to be a maintenance contract. With our websites, we have to keep them updated all the time, and the hackers will bombard them. And all you can do is keep everything updated and locked down and secure.
So you're recommending hosting through yourselves?
No. I mean, all I'm saying is that any website company that is maintaining websites on an ongoing basis will be keeping the software updated. I.e., you cannot, particularly with anything that is open source, such as WordPress, Omaka probably to a lesser extent, because it's less widely used. The hackers will go for WordPress. Any website company that is also maintaining those sites will be constantly updating them.
Thank you.
So there are a number of, some interesting discussion on here about transcription software, free transcription software. So I'd suggest people look there. There's some questions. So Michael Batchelor says that most recommendations are for flat catalogues. What is the recommendation for hierarchical collections? It was Atom, I think, wasn't it?
Well, there is Atom. I mean, in fairness, Omaka, within flat catalogings are based on a cataloging standard called Dublin Core. If you look in the appendix of the Community Archive cataloging guidelines, you'll see the same point that I'm about to make. But Dublin Core contains one field called is part of and another field called has part. And those fields are basically designed to record relationships, kind of parent-child relationships between two items. So that's basically recording a hierarchy. So you can do that within Dublin Core. So you've got a hierarchical catalog. You could go on to Omaka, you could record the structure of it. Now make sure those fields are exported. That does it, but it won't display the hierarchy for you. You won't get a kind of tree view within Omaka because that's not what it's designed to do.
And Michael also asked, can you have a watermark protection added to photos and scanned images added as part of the upload process?
You can, not necessarily the upload. I mean, the normal thing is because you are uploading reference images and not your original source images, and because the reference images you upload to the internet are designed to be, big enough to be viewed comfortably on the internet, but not to be printed. By and large, the funders, for example, are keen on you releasing those images out into the wild, basically releasing them under a Creative Commons license, as it's called. That doesn't mean you've lost control over your original source images, and you can still sell them. You could sell the high resolution copies of them. If you want to watermark them, I would watermark them as a batch process when you upload when you're creating the reference images, and there's software that can do that easier than doing it on the fly as you upload.
So we're kind of 5 minutes over time, but there's one last question that read out, and then perhaps we can say a little bit about what happens next by way of where the recording will be available. There's been a question about whether the slides will also be available and the links. So Peter Lavender asks, what software can you use to get a changing set of photos? We've found the Norfolk Archives project brilliant with free training and massive advice. Our challenge is that we are, and I'm just losing this, we are building our own site using HTML because our own old site was hosted by Wix and too inflexible, lots of coding and junk behind every item. We are learning to build the site and catalog it as a team. It's the only way, but it takes a long time. I'm not sure what the question was there, but it seemed that what software can you use to get a changing set of photos?
Sounds like it's a rotating, what they call a rotating slideshow where things kind of move through. I mean, if you're building it from scratch and coding it yourself in HTML, I mean, there will be things out there, jQuery libraries, but it's quite a business. I mean, if you were kind of doing it, Wix is proprietary software. WordPress, I think, is quite a good option for that sort of thing. And then you can just get a little plugin you can install for a rotating slideshow. But if you're doing HTML, yes, there's work involved in that.
Excellent. Well, I hope I've covered everybody's questions, and there's been some interesting answers that have been presented in the chat to other people's questions. So Jack, can I just leave it to you to say any final words about any follow-ups on this, like as I said, where the recording's going to be, etc., etc.
Well, so in terms of the overall presentation, we've recorded it, and there's a process in the Community Archives and Heritage Group. We sent it off to somebody. I think he's doing this voluntarily, so I'm not quite sure how long it will take, but we will, in due course, try and get the video up on the Community Archives website. The slideshows, probably not so much, simply because, as you saw, half the time I was kind of showing websites, so the slides themselves are a little bit patchy. It's not uninterrupted sequence. We are going to send out an email if Eventbrite will let us to you all with the list of links that I mentioned. I'm, you can see my email address there. I'm happy to kind of talk to people and answer queries as I can. I think that's probably it.
Well,
really.
The chat is full of thanks for the presentation, and everybody seems to have found it really interesting and helpful. So,
oh, bless their hearts! Thank you all. Thank you all. I wish I could see your faces. I've lost them all.
Well,
now,
if people do want to, as we're drawing to a close now, if people do want to turn their videos on, and microphones on, you can kind of sort of show your appreciation in the traditional
thunderous.
And you'll have to stop sharing, I think, Jack.
Oh, I'll stop sharing. Okay, hang on a second. How do I do that? There we go. Oh, there we all are. There you are. You're all back.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. And as Jack said, if there are questions, then I'm going to say send them to Jack. So he'll be delighted with that idea. But you can also find out more information and guidance and stuff on the Community Archives website as a starting point. So thank you all for attending. It's been a great morning, I think, and thank you very much, Jack.
Great pleasure. Great pleasure. Bye all. Bye all.
Bye.